Hi, everybody. Welcome to Strong Christian Female. I want to introduce Kelli Palfy. Now, her book, Men Too, is linked below, as well as other information on how to get in touch with her. She is an amazing woman. She's going to share some of her stories, so I will not share it here. But I wanted you to know that I actually interviewed her because she's an expert in sexual trauma and human trafficking. So this was actually done initially for the America Unchained Project, but you're going to see that. You're going to see that embedded into my video. But she is a fascinating Christian woman who has been so dedicated to this. I also wanted to share it here on Strong Christian Female. Moving forward, you're going to see clips from her and different things appear also on Strong Christian Female. So don't get confused. It is actually being done for the American Unchained Project initially, but I let her know that it was such a good interview and she had such a Christ-centered worldview and she's just such a wonderful woman who loves Jesus. I wanted to share it with this audience as well. So without further ado, Dr. Kelli Palfy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the America Unchained Project podcast. I am excited today about our guest, Dr. Kelli Palfy. She is the author of Men Too. It is a book that is dealing with the sexual trauma and sexual abuse of men. This is an important topic for our society, for this time in history. But also, if you have boys in your life, this is a topic that is hard for them to talk about and maybe even hard to recognize the signs of. So Dr. Kelli is here to talk to us today about that. And it's a very important, prevalent thing in my life personally. As many of you know, I have 3 sons, but also because I have engaged with men over the years that something happened to them and it made them struggle or feel shame. And I've never really known what to say to them, except that they are loved and that should not be the identity they carry. But I love that today I'm going to learn more from Dr. Palfy about what to look for, but also maybe how to steer those conversations. So Dr. Palfy, hello. I'm so excited you're here. And I know you've graciously said I can call you Kelli. So hi, Kelli.
Hi.
So Kelli, before we start, just tell us a little bit about who you are. How everyone has a story as to how they got into this and why you chose to write.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So it's a bit of a story. So prior to becoming a psychologist, I was a Royal Canadian Mounted police officer. So I did active duty for about 13 and a half years. And I was always drawn to sex crimes. So I would take on these sex crimes investigations. And then in about 2002, I was asked to join this unit that was being developed called the Integrated Child Sexual Exploitation Unit. So we started up this unit in response to problems that already existed. So we had a big case come in from the US, actually. It was the Department of Homeland Security and your US Postal Service that had done a joint investigation in regards to some suspicious packages. They discovered that they contained child pornographic images. And they, basically did a proper investigation, gained a bunch of credit card numbers of people who had actually purchased these illicit images. So approximately 350 of these purchasers were Canadian. Several of them, 90 of them, I think, were residing in British Columbia, which is where I was residing at the time. So we developed this unit in response to this case and other ones of similar nature. And so we had to learn how to investigate these cases. We were starting to teach other agencies how to handle these cases because, of course, we would farm the investigations out to the police in the jurisdiction where the offenders were living. And we were also, I was the file coordinator for the RCMP's first sex tourism charge. So that involves where a Canadian travels abroad for the purposes of exploiting a child. So on several of these investigations, I was required to actually review the data, obviously. And I was seeing boys as victims. And to be honest, I was very shocked. And to be brutally honest, I did not initially recognize it as abuse. And I'm very ashamed to admit that, but it's true. Because unfortunately, in these images, the boys are not always. There's difference. I don't want to ever negate the different types of sexual abuse, but oftentimes these boys are seen as willing participants. because they're young and they don't know what they're participating in, right? It's not going to bother them until later on in life when they learn what they've done and the meaning behind this. So I initially missed it as abuse. And we had a private lecture from a pro hockey player, one of the first pro hockey players to ever come out with his abuse history. And he told us the reasons that he hadn't reported. And so I was just, it was like God opened my eyes. Honestly, I have to say God opened my eyes to this issue. I had been a corrections officer prior to becoming a police officer. And I remember being very confused of wondering, like, I'd grown up in a pretty gross environment, to be honest. And like the women in my world were not exactly healthy. And so I just remember wondering why there were so many men in jail compared to women, because I'd had bad experiences with a lot of women. So I was honestly very confused about this. But when this pro hockey player started talking about why he hadn't talked about it and how he'd turned to drugs and alcohol, the reasons he hadn't told like people that he was being abused, reasons like, his coach was his abuser and his coach was potentially his means to go pro. And if he'd have reported him, that would have hampered his ability to go pro. He knew he had the skills and he knew his coach had the means to get him there. He also was raised in poverty and his career was literally lifting his family out of poverty. Plus, he felt that some of his parents' teammates knew that he was being abused but did nothing. And that infuriated me. But it also opened my eyes, right, to the fact that we kind of ignore things that we see. And it kind of sounds crazy, but at the time, I was going through significant bullying in my career, and he talked about living this double life. So when he said those words, those really resonated with me because I too was living a double life. I mean, here I was, a cop with a badge and a gun, being bullied by my supervisors, and I did not know how to stop it. So my heart really went out to him. And I would say fast forward a few years, I lost my career to the bullying. And I was this is literally what brought me to my knees for the first time. So I was like, God, please, you have to give me something to be passionate about. I can't, no offense to waitresses, but I just didn't feel like I just could not go back to waitressing after having done all this work. And I was like, God, you got to give me a career to be passionate about, or I might become suicidal. I don't even know. So he reminded me of this lecture that I'd been in with Sheldon Kennedy was his name, and how desperately I'd wanted to help him, but felt like I couldn't. So when I got kind of like what you and I were talking about beforehand, God, if you open the doors, I'll go. So that was my prayer. If you open the doors for me to go to U of A, I will research this and find out why boys and men are not discussing this. So that's what I did was, part of it was conviction about having missed this. I was like, in my mind, I was aware that I was literally being trained as the subject matter expert and I was missing this. So if I'm missing this and I'm the police lady investigating it, what about the rest of the world? So I was so excited to have the opportunity. So went to U of A and I researched why boys and men do not disclose sexual abuse. And I can tell you there are a lot of reasons that span from when the abuse first begins to their entire lifetime. But that's a whole nother subject. And that's covered in my book if people want to learn about that. But that's how I got interested in this. And it's a crazy God story how he opened the doors for me to go to U of A. As far as I'm concerned, I had no business being there. But anyways, yeah.
I mean, he doesn't need someone who's the most qualified. He needs someone who's the most willing, right?
Well,
and he does it all the time. You're like, wow, why am I? But I think we won't go down this rabbit trail, but what I love about God is he puts you in a place that's a little over your head so you trust in him at all times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And he's, because if we were like, I got this, I tend to not lean on God at all. If I'm like, I can do this, I'm amazing. Yeah. Like God's like, well, you're not listening to me anymore. So see you in a minute, see when you come back around. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I stopped listening to you.
Yeah.
So going back to this amazing reality check. Like you said, at first you were honest and you said, I did not recognize this as abuse.
Yeah.
That to me is so key for people. They need to hear this.
Yeah.
For some reason, we box girls and boys when it comes to sexual abuse in different categories,
Yeah.
especially if those
Oh.
boys are teenagers,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because they're little boys, we're like, this is defilement. But if they're teenagers, we think somehow they're compliant.
That it's a rite of passage.
Absolutely. Even if it's by a woman, like how many women have hit on their students and like for some reason they will convince the student he's complicit and compliant and because of, like you said, it's a rite of passage.
Yeah.
We don't look at it as predatorial or grooming. So let's start down this path. So as a mom, I am very hawkish about where my kids go online, when they go online, who they talk to. None of them are on social media, even though I have two teenage boys. And my oldest is like, I don't even want a smartphone, Mom. I just want a phone. And so he has a phone, like an old school, like you have to like tab it to text, but he wanted it. I was like, okay, we have to, I understand we need to teach our kids to live in the world they live in. I recognize that. But what we as parents, I think, don't often stop and realize is the world is coming to devour our children.
Oh my God.
And they are not adults. They do not deserve adult level privacy. They've not earned this place in life. So when you started recognizing this, I want to know as a parent, and I know that we could go in a lot of different directions because there's so much you've written about and so much you've even talked about. And by the way, this is a great time to mention this to those that are listening. Dr. Kelli has actually done an extensive podcast with Focus on the Family Canada. We will link that below as soon as that goes live in August. If this is out a little bit before it has come out, don't worry. When it comes out, we'll put it below. But she's gone into much more detail than what we're going to talk about today. But because one of the biggest passions I have in my heart is to protect our children, keep them safe, and if something has happened, pull them up out of shame and restore them. What would you tell parents they need to be either protecting their children from engaging with, or when you actually see signs, what we need to be looking for?
Okay, so first off, I would say that I would agree with you. The world we're living in now, we do not have the luxury anymore of not educating our children. We have to educate our children. And I know certain people, even my own advisor at U of A, would disagree with that. She would say it's not up to kids to protect themselves. But the reality is sexual abuse is so rampant and the predators are so rampant and they are not being properly policed because they are plentiful and our police are overwhelmed. I know that from the clients that I work with that tell me they don't have time to get to these files. And I know that from just my own previous work. So we have to educate our children about grooming, about sexual abuse. And I don't mean we have to scare them. Fear is learned, but we do need to teach our children that just because someone presents as lovely and kind and helpful and loving does not mean that they always have the right agenda. Not that everybody's bad, but that some people, bottom line, if someone tries to touch you or show you illicit pictures, that's not good, right? Like you have to come tell an authority figure, a parent or a teacher or something that's not doing that. And if they don't help you, go tell someone else, right? And that, so unfortunately we do have to teach our children these things. Myself and a colleague have just put out, it's in the process of being loaded. By the time this podcast is up, it will be available. But we've created a book series called the Creating Personal Safety series, which is a 3-part book series so that, parents struggling with like, what do I say to my children about grooming, about sexual abuse, specifically male sexual abuse, you can just read your children these books. So, and it has lists of what we feel is an appropriate, like age appropriate way to teach your children about abuse without scaring the crap out of them. So
yeah,
because
that's a very key thing is we don't. The whole stranger danger thing, I've mentioned this on different podcasts I've done, not this one, but I never taught my kids to fear other people. But what I always taught them to do was ask permission. You
Love
cannot
that.
go anywhere without permission. You
Right.
cannot do this without permission. You must ask mom and dad. You can't cross the street. You can't go talk to neighbor Joe, who we had a great relationship with. My son it was so ingrained in his mind. Like he would be like, Mom, like he would have to come get me. And so there were a couple of times, and it was rare that I told him no, but most of the time I just needed to know where he was. So it was the same outcome,
Mm-hmm.
but without instilling fear in him of his neighborhood, of
Yeah,
his neighbors.
sure.
I think and I think you hit it on the head. There's an age appropriate level. I have a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 9-year-old. I am not going to present the same information the same way to my 9-year-old that my 15-year-old is able to listen to. He was actually even watching a clean
Mm-hmm.
documentary with me the other day. He's 15. And it got to a point where, because of my background in this, I wasn't creeped out at all. But I always tell my kids, listen, you're not me. And if something's bothering you, you have every right to say, Mom, I don't want to watch this part.
Cool.
And in hindsight, it made sense.
Yeah.
He hadn't been exposed to some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, Mom, I don't want to watch this part.
Cool.
And I was like,
good.
So I finished it on my own. And then I said, hey, when that part ends, this is what happens. Do you want to finish? And he said, okay, I just want to skip that part. It was bothering me.
Well,
and it should bother you.
Probably what's bothering him most is watching it with you, right? He could probably watch it on his own, but watching something sexual with your parent is not comfortable, right? So, yeah.
And it was pain. I mean, it was a documentary explaining, from a Christian worldview, explaining, some of the messages that kids are getting.
Yeah.
So it was definitely tame for most 15-year-olds, but you make a very good point. So that actually brings up another topic. When you're presenting this information to your children, how would you say a parent should expect their children to respond? Number one, this is mom or dad talking about, even if it's appropriate, sexual topics. We're talking about naked bodies. We're talking about, even if we're talking to a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, some parents shut down because they don't expect their child to respond a certain way.
Honestly,
do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, but I'm sorry, but I'm going to put that back on you and say, honestly, I think that's why we have to start young. And I know for a lot of your listeners, it might be too late, but we need to start young, teaching our children the appropriate body parts, male and female, using the appropriate terminology, so that, because if you're afraid to use that, they're going to think they shouldn't be using those words either, right? So, and I just want to say, I love what you said about respecting your child's boundaries. That's huge. I think one of the things that we in Western culture have have done not a good job of in the past is forcing our kids to say, kiss Auntie Phyllis or whatever, and hug so-and-so, right? Like when their gut instincts are saying, no, I don't want to do that, and you force them, they get this message that they're not allowed to listen to their own instincts, and that they have to allow adults to touch them, even though they don't want it. So I'm a big advocate that, we have to respect our children's boundaries so that they have bodily autonomy. And to, give them the choice. Do you want to, hug Auntie Phyllis? I'm saying it's okay. If you want to, you can, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. So I love that you said you respected his boundaries.
Yeah. And that's a great point too. Like my niece has children and they don't really know me yet. Like I come in and out, and after, if I've been there multiple days, they're so sweet. They want to play with me, but I always tell them, like, if they're like, do you want to give her a hug? I'm like, you don't have to hug me.
Yeah, me
we
too.
can high five. I can wave at you. And sometimes they'll wave at me and I wave back, or sometimes they'll high five me and sometimes they hug me. But I agree with you. I think I would never want a child to dread me because I'm being forced on them, even though I know I'm a safe person. They don't know me well enough to know I'm a safe person. And some kids are far less physical than other kids, and they aren't affectionate naturally. And that's a boundary you're forcing to break with them. And so I love that you mentioned that, because I think as parents, if we're a touchy-feely person, we don't understand why our child wouldn't follow suit, or you're afraid. Let's be fair. As parents, we're like, well, I don't want grandma to be offended. I don't want Auntie Phyllis to be mad at me. Get over it. This is your child. They have their own say in the body, and we need to make them feel like they can say what they don't want.
Well, the other thing is that they may have information that you don't have. For example, grandpa touched me in a weird way, right? I wasn't so comfortable with that. So, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Like my grandpa used to give noogies,
yeah,
and I know it's not
yeah.
sexual, but I hated it. And because of he would grab me and like force me to like, and I don't know why he did it. Like it's weird on hindsight, but it made me not want to touch him.
Yeah.
Like, and I think you're 100% right. There are things that kids pick up on or that may have been done, God forbid, to them that you aren't aware of. And if there is a boundary being broken,
Mm-hmm.
you need to, you don't need to grill your child, but you should never shame them into
Mm-hmm.
physical touch. That's like you said, that's setting them up for potential abuse, or at least putting them in harm's way down the road, potentially, if we don't let them draw boundaries that are strict.
Yeah.
So that actually is a good, well, finish what you were going to say. I apologize.
No, I was just going to say, may I use that as a segue into what we've kind of wanted to talk about? Because, you said
That's
like even
perfect.
even the noogies, right? So, like you mentioned before, I mean, yes, stranger danger is still something we need to be aware of, but 94% of sexual abuse happens by someone that the parent and or the child or both know and love. So, like when you mentioned those noogies, right? Offenders have a process that they typically go through, a grooming process that they go through typically before they offend against a child, right? So part of that process will include, well, first off, they groom themselves by putting themselves in, educating themselves, getting themselves into a situation where they will have unfettered access to children. Unfortunately, that's the case. That's the reality. So they'll go get the degree that they need to so that they can be a teacher or a coach or whatever, right? That's the reality. They will put themselves in that situation. So that's stage one. They groom themselves. Stage two, they groom the parent. So they will befriend the parent. They will fill a need. They will win the parent's trust, establish a relationship. Step three, they win the trust and affection of the child. During that initial phase, before any sexual abuse ever takes place, they will establish non-sexual physical touch. So they will roughhouse with the kids, tickle them, give them noogies, wrestle, teach them how to subdue other children, play tackle football, often in front of the parent so that it is deemed that that physical touch between the two of them is acceptable. Now, I know that can be very confusing because, lots of, like a majority of the people in your child's world hopefully will be non-offending people. But we have to be aware that the people that we want to kind of watch out for are often the ones that it seems either too good to be true, or maybe you feel like you're doing them a favor, something like that, right? Maybe you got a red flag, maybe not, but if you do, please do not ignore warning signs that you might feel. So one thing that we want to be really cautious about as far as protecting our children is anytime an adult is trying to get alone time with your child. So let's say they've got tickets to a hockey game in a different city and they've only got one extra ones and they're willing to take your child. Ding, 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 red flag to me, right? Like, now you're going to be alone in a hotel room with my son? Not happening. I don't care how great of a relationship or how wonderful of a person, that is the process, and to me that is just too high of a risk, whether they're family or not. I mean, like in my book, a lot of my participants, at least half of them were abused by a biological relative.
Oh, and that's the challenge. That's the challenge people have with this truth.
Hmm.
You will, if a child is sexually abused, you probably know them.
Oh yeah.
And that is something parents, it is so difficult. I knew a girl growing up, a wonderful girl. She was younger than me in my youth group, just a delightful, delightful girl. And when I was in college, she was, I think, a junior or senior in high school, and she was raped by her brother-in-law in her own home. And she came forward, and thank God everyone believed her. And she became pregnant, and she gave her baby up for adoption. So it became a beautiful story out of a terrible story. But she was believed. And that was so joyful for everyone involved. I mean, just a tender, sweet heart of a woman. But even her sister believed her. And that must have been one of the hardest things that sister ever did. And yet, in hindsight, I'm like, what a brave woman. But to believe her sister because of the integrity of this girl. And yet it is a hellacious thought to think that you would know someone who would harm your own children. My dad once told me, if anything ever happened to my kids, just give him a call. He's happy to go to jail on my behalf. He was sort of joking, but I actually just know my dad. Like, this righteous anger will well up in you. And yet this is someone you've probably had a relationship with for a really long time. That aside, though, because that's a conversation unto itself, like why these sicko predators would prey on such innocence. If your child, for whatever reason, what would you say to parents to be looking for? Let's say a parent is listening and they're saying, well, I don't really have anybody who's hanging out with my kids and I'm not paying attention that I know of, or should I suspect people in my life? We don't want to suspect falsely people in our life. We understand that. That's a fear thing. And yet, what would you say parents have got to watch for as far as signs from their child that something is wrong?
Different things at different ages. Like oftentimes in the very young children, they'll be talking about a tummy ache all the time, or because they're upset and they don't understand like the emotional implications. Or kids that can't sleep, or kids that are regressing, like were potty trained and now they're wetting the bed. The child that's falling asleep in class sometimes. Honestly, sometimes kids that are diagnosed with learning disabilities or ADHD or ODD, these are often manifestations of the trauma versus the actual versus what they've been diagnosed with. So sometimes it's the class clown because, to be the class clown is easier than to say, admit I'm not following because I'm so distracted by my own trauma that I don't understand what's going on because because if a child's abused early in life, they may not learn how to self-regulate. They may not, they won't be able to pay attention in class because they're so distracted by nightmares or daytime flashes of, they're just dissociated basically. So that can cause a child to fall behind academically. Um, Unfortunately, there is no like one tell or anything like that. Like several of the participants in my book were A students that were like high level athletes because it's crazy, but the one in my research said, I just knew that if I wanted to have a better life, he was being abused by his mother. And he said, I knew if I wanted to have a better life for myself, I had to do well in school because that was my only ticket out. Right. And he was meaning I have to make it through college. So he in his own mind knew he had to suffer this because, one thing, so just sorry, I'll segue just for a second, then I'll get back to it. But like boys often fear that they're not going to be believed. Lots of times, females feel that they will always have that support because it's pretty common knowledge that females get sexually abused. But it is still a bit of a taboo in society for boys to admit that they've been victimized or for people to recognize sexual abuse as sexual abuse because, like we mentioned earlier, it's seen more as a rite of passage, as a coming of age. Even their own friends, if they were to disclose to them, might say, oh, you're lucky, versus, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, right? They get treated very differently by society, but also by the offender, which is a whole nother segue. But other warning signs that you might want to watch for is like I say, kids that can't pay attention in school, kids that are falling asleep in class, bruises, that kind of stuff, kids without changes of clothes. But we're not necessarily talking that children have to come from a lower socioeconomic status to be abused. That's not the case. All children have needs. So unfortunately, offenders will look to fill any void. So if, for example, children that are more vulnerable, like those without a father at home or moms working 3 jobs, yes, they are more vulnerable, maybe more situated so that they rely more heavily on other resources where offenders will obviously make themselves be available as a resource. But the reality is any kid from any socioeconomic status can be abused, right? Um, yeah, in teenagers, I would actually watch for sudden and drastic changes in behavior. Now, oftentimes these are kind of chalked up as like, oh, they're turning into a teenager, but that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So when children all of a sudden, when young boys or girls all of a sudden go from being like, attending Christian youth group, wanting to hang out with parents, to not wanting anything to do with their parents, to experimenting with drugs and alcohol and that kind of stuff. Those are huge warning signs or red flags to me. Often offenders will introduce them to substances. They will introduce them to pornography. With boys, they often offer to teach them how to masturbate, or they often teach them about masturbation. So I think it's very important that parents teach their boys, especially, about masturbation, that it's a solo sport. You can say, we prefer you don't do this, but offenders will often, they kind of treat it like the forbidden fruit, like, did God really say that you're going to die, or will you be like him? So offenders will kind of say, look, everybody does this. This is what men do. Your parents just don't want you to know how. But offenders will treat young boys as if they're older than they are. So that's another red flag to watch for, and you may not necessarily see this, but offenders of teenage boys, for example, will try to introduce them to more masculine principles than are age appropriate. Maybe even introducing them to alcohol, drugs, driving, pornography, ask them what they know about sex, and then offer to teach them, that kind of thing. So oftentimes these boys have done things that they know their parents would not allow. So the offender will kind of throw that back on them and say, you can't tell your mom and dad, because if you do, we'll both get in trouble. So, or they'll make threats, like, threaten to either start abusing the younger sibling, threaten to, wreck dad's reputation, that kind of thing. So it's crazy the way offenders will use threats. But, so the other warning sign out of that would be unexplained anger, right? Like, your teenagers walking around with a chip on their shoulder. Why? I mean, many teens can make it through their teenage years and still experience all the hormonal changes without having this huge chip on their shoulder. So if your teenager is refusing to talk to you or pushing you away, because especially, teenagers who've done something they know they could be in trouble for, or that they don't want to talk about, they will distance themselves from those that they're closest to because they don't want to accidentally disclose. Right?
And
So,
that's they don't, because they don't want the shame of it,
shame,
or the threat, or
yeah,
whatever, or
yeah,
they don't want that. What you and I know are normally completely hollow threats.
yeah,
They don't know that.
yeah,
They don't
absolutely.
know the fact of addiction, and so they are afraid they're going to start this snowball.
Yeah,
It's like with any other human trafficking thing I've ever learned, there's always an innocent, meaning like the threat of an innocent. If they
absolutely, yeah.
themselves will take it and say,
Mhm.
I'm oversimplifying, but if they are willing to take the hit, so to speak,
Yes.
and come forward,
Mm.
but if then that groomer or that aggressor will say, well, what about and they'll go for an innocent, a little brother, little sister,
Mhm.
cousin, even a child, if it's a young mom, and they'll just go down the list until they find what currency will work with that child, and they'll hold that against them to
Yeah.
keep them quiet.
And they're not always empty
So as a
threats.
parent,
They're not always empty threats, right?
no,
Because, yeah, if you've got the coach who
that's
has
a fair
access
point.
to other people, or, yeah, I mean, I've heard of cases where the male will take the abuse so that his younger sibling won't have to, or that his classmate won't be starting to, yeah. So oftentimes
Yeah,
boys,
or they want to stay on the team.
sorry?
They don't want to be pulled from the team. Or like you were saying about the coach,
Mhm.
they'll pull them from the team
Mhm.
a couple of times to let them know they mean
Yeah,
business if they resist
yeah.
whatever it is that abuser is wanting to do. And when they realize, oh, he means it, they'll come.
Yeah, I just watched a fantastic movie called Athlete A. I think it was called, on Netflix. And it was such a great, I mean, it's against a female, but it was such a great, just sort of example of how prolific and how sheltered a lot of the offenders are, because that story is about a doctor who was the team doctor for all the Olympic athletes, the young girls. But I mean, he was touching them all and telling them that it was physiotherapy, right? And they believed it until one of them said, hey, feels kind of weird. This is odd. Does he do this to you? Oh yeah, he does it to me. So she didn't say anything for a while yet, but like, and he'd been getting away with it for years. And the university just tells them that it's in the line of, physiotherapy or whatever. Like, it the sad reality is oftentimes these pedophiles will work together so that whoever is abusing the person that they would report to is also an abuser, so they will cover for each other. It's crazy how connected they are. It's crazy. But we're seeing that all over the media.
We're seeing the media be complicit in basically accepting child abuse and grooming in the classroom or anywhere else. And that's something that people will get angry when they hear, but they don't get angry at someone trying to wake them up. They get angry. They get angry at the person who's the messenger, who's saying, do you realize this is sexual grooming? They'll say, well, no, the news told me that it was perfectly acceptable because it's teaching kids things they need to know. Who says they need to know? Like, I don't care who you are. You do not have the right to tell my child about sex without my permission. Mm-hmm. I don't want you standing in front of a class talking about any sex to my children unless I know, because my husband is a physician assistant. He's talked to my kids openly about anything they've ever asked him. He's got biology books he takes out when they're little. When I was pregnant with one of the kids, he's like, let's look at body parts. This is what's going on in mommy's body.
It's awesome. Yeah.
This is what's going on. And this is, they're like, how did that happen? Well, let's talk about how God made the body, and this is amazing, and this is how it works. And you're right. You have to take the shame off of it, off of the right stuff, off of their body and off of growing up and getting married and having sex. But if I found out that Timmy's mommy was telling my 9-year-old sexual things, I'd be floored.
Red flag.
Then why is it acceptable for their teacher to do the same thing? Yeah. Like, I'm like, you don't have the right to talk to my children without my permission. Because it's, to me, I don't know what you're saying. Yeah. I don't know if it's in a medical context, and I would like to be there, please. I've actually attended talks that were age appropriate for my kids, but I sat there and some of the stuff that was presented, I actually held issue to. It wasn't vulgar or overly sexualized, but the spin put on it was a little. So I had a few questions at the end, very kind questions. They didn't like that I had questions, but but even if it was perfectly fine, parents, I knew what was said to my child so that if he had a question, I knew how to answer it. Yeah. And that's the most important thing. We've got to be more engaged in our children's lives because the information they're receiving may be 100% perfectly fine, but it could get messed up in here, and then it's going to come out and you're going to go, whoa, I got to straighten this out. Yeah. And if you're a teacher, my personal opinion is you got to guard yourself. You've got to guard yourself. Like, why would you open that Pandora's box of trying to explain something to children without their parents knowing? Because as a teacher, why would you want to be liable for that child going home? And even if they misunderstood the conversation, now you're in hot water. So I don't know. I'm just a strong advocate of be in your children's business. Like, it's not your teacher's job to sexually educate your child. Yeah. You've got to be willing to do it.
Well, and this is a good example of why we need to be very open with our children. And Charity, in the beginning, you asked me, how do we control their responses? I honestly would like to say, be more worried about controlling your own response, right? Like, you need to be able to, not professionally, but in a loving way, respond to your child's questions in an age-appropriate, loving way. So that means educating yourself first about what they need to know, like understanding grooming, understanding how and where sexual abuse happens, which there's a million examples in my book, and many other books too. But yeah, so, and then controlling your own response, answering them honestly, because honestly, it's not going to make them be interested in rushing out and having intercourse. If you start young, the kids are just going to go, oh, gross. They're just going to say, I want to do that. And you don't want to do that? That's fine. You don't ever have to do that, right? Which, of course, they'll change their mind when they get older, right? Hopefully. But yeah, but there is something that's called the law of first mention. So basically, whoever gets to educate the child first, it becomes sort of that foundation that they build upon and that they compare every other piece of information to. So that is a big reason why we have to be the first to educate children, to teach them the truth, right? The truth about their bodies and about their bodily autonomy and about their right to protect themselves. And, just yeah, like I said earlier, that children don't need to be taught how to masturbate, that if they're going to do that, it's a solo sport. No one has to teach you how to do that, right? Like that's one of the ways that offenders will start to abuse a child, is say, this is what guys do when they're alone. Do you do this?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
it's crazy.
Well, and it's like similar to what Dr. Seuss said, the first person to a child's heart wins. I think that's so true. Like whoever establishes the norm, which should be parents.
Mhm.
And again, parents, I get it. Like I grew up in a house, you never talked about sex.
Yeah.
Like never, never, never,
Yeah.
never, never,
Yeah.
never. But luckily I had a youth group that, with all the parents' permission, they said, listen, parents, you're welcome to sit in here. You can know everything we're about to talk about. This is what we're going to talk about. And they separated the boys and the girls, and they talked about, in a healthy perspective, what this is. And they allowed questions. They didn't shame anybody for having questions. And, if you don't have the resources, or you're like me and you might be like, I don't know where to even start, or, or maybe you're a single parent and you have an opposite sex child and you're like, what's normal for me to say? I don't want to make them uncomfortable. Get a book. Get a video, you watch it, you learn. And if they're like what you were saying earlier, Dad, I don't want to watch this with you. Mom, I don't want to, but it's good information. It's solid information. It's healthy. Say, I'm not going to embarrass you. I'm not going to make you watch this with me, but I'm asking you to watch it. And if you have any questions, I would like for you to talk to me about it. Or here's a book, or like, oh, absolutely. Yeah. Or yeah. And I think that's the thing is we, like you said, we do not live in an age and time where we can accept ignorance is bliss. It is not bliss. And as parents and guardians and teachers, we've got to arm ourselves with information that is accurate, so that when the false information comes, not only can we combat it, but like you said, we can present the truth first, so that when something creepy and perverted comes into our children's lives, which is what grooming is, they see that something's off. There's something's weird. I don't feel, and my kids, we tell them, hey, if something, absolutely, if something feels off, if something just makes you feel uncomfortable, you can call us. You can tell us, my son was at a party. It wasn't a sexual situation, but there were some things happening that he was uncomfortable with. And he knew we would ask no questions. We would just come get him. But he told me, I didn't know how to explain it to their parents, because he really likes their parents. I said, no offense. I know their parents. They might be bummed that you left, but they would want their son to do the same thing. And they would never question you needing to leave. I think parents, we need to make an open door for kids where they know there's no punishment, there's no shame. And any kid in your house, like God forbid a kid come to me and confess some creepy stuff, because they need to know I'm going to tell mom and dad. I mean, unless mom and dad, unfortunately, are the unhealthy people. But
Which happens.
It
Which
happens.
does happen.
Like you said, control your response.
Mm-hmm.
Like listen,
support,
believe,
yeah,
support.
yeah.
Well, phone a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Do whatever you got to do to get the resources, but get the resources.
Yeah, and there are tons of resources listed in my book. Like,
Yay.
sometimes, we've touched on a lot of things, but if you need more information about that subject, or if you need more information about how to talk to your kids or how to support them, or the messages not to send, you said in earlier, like about, making sure that you'd never want to send the message to your children that we don't talk about sex in this family, right? Because if they are sexually abused, they think I can't tell my parents I did something wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question, I know we're wrapping up. So first, again, everyone watching, I will list her, Dr. Kelli's book, as well as her link to her series with Focus on the Family Canada. And once I have the information on this wonderful book for parents, for kids, I'm going to get one. I know you said it sounds like they're age appropriate and listed out. But I guess we'll end with one last question. If you could tell parents one piece of advice on how to safeguard their kids, what would it be?
Watch out for the situation that seems too good to be true, to be honest, and do not ignore your own red flags. So there's something called willful blindness, and I talk about this in detail in my book, and there's actually another book called Willful Blindness that I would recommend reading, which is listed in my book. But it's this concept where you get this quick glimpse of something that looks like it might not be quite right. And then we kind of do this where we go, I can't believe I thought that, right? But those are the instincts. Those are the times that we should not be doing that. That's when we should be going, okay, what was that I thought I saw? Or what basically our brains, we have gut instinct, right? Our guts are able to pick up on information that our brains cannot process as fast as our gut response does. So we cannot ignore those gut responses. And we have to teach our children the same. Do not ignore your gut responses. Trust your guts. Like 85% of the time, our gut responses are actually accurate. So that would be my big piece of advice, is do not ignore your gut instinct. And watch out for, there's a great book I love, and I don't expect people to read it. And you know what, I'm going to be rewriting my book hopefully in the next year or two to include information from this book, but it's about predators, and it's a heavy read. It's not a fun read, but the one thing that I really want to send your listeners home with is that predators are prolific, and they love to target Christians because they consider us naive. And they also recognize that we are supposed to look for the good in people, and that we are supposed to give the benefit of the doubt, and that we are supposed to forgive. And they basically consider Christian venues easy targets. So they will, when we were praying before this podcast, the word unimaginable came to me. So I guess I just want parents to recognize that unimaginable does happen. The research shows that one out of every six boys is sexually abused to some extent by a physical contact, means of physical contact prior to the age of 16. I think what do they say? One in every three girls, one in every six boys. And I honestly think those statistics are more close to even, just that boys are not reporting. So we need to be aware that these people that are almost being that resource that's like the savior, there's your red flag in my mind. Thank God we've got Uncle Bill to drive Jesse to basketball. And oh my gosh, he sits with them every week, right? Like, if an adult does not have an excuse to be there, or children of their own that they're there watching, an adult that does not have healthy relationships of their own age, an adult that struggles to fit in, those are your red flags. An adult that seems too good to be true, yeah. Watch for the
Yeah.
ones that just seem to be the savior. Sorry, but it's true.
No, it's not, it's absolutely true. And I think you hit on so many things in just that last comment. I'll let them sit because I could like rabbit trail, and I know we're out of time.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you so much for being on this podcast.
You're welcome.
For those again watching, look below for all the resources we talked about. Also, any questions you might have, feel free to send them to me directly, and I can either save them for a future podcast, or I can shoot them to Dr. Kelli. And Dr. Kelli, last question. This is not about your book at all, but do you still do private practice? And if so, how do people get a hold of you for that?
Well, I'm only allowed to work with clients that live in Alberta, so your listeners, unfortunately. I do have lots of resources on my website, kellipalfy.com. There's lots of other videos with different topics and stuff. My book has a lot of information in it. It has links to a bunch of other helpful books that I recommend. And yeah, sorry, but I'm only allowed to work with people from Alberta. But
that's okay.
I also just want to say, Charity, one thing that you just said that I think was really good that I would encourage other parents to do. You said, I sat in on those courses. I really encourage parents, even if you can't be at every practice, let your presence be known when, say, a coach is not expecting it. Show up even once unexpectedly, because then they don't fear that you won't do it again, kind of thing, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. That is an excellent point. We have felt as parents like we're stepping over a line, being at school or being at certain places, as if that's not our territory. Yeah. Your child is your territory. Even if it's volunteering at school, cutting papers for teachers, you get to know. The best thing I ever did was sub occasionally at school. I got to know all the kids and I got to know the parents. I got to feel out what was going on here and there. There was a bullying situation, it wasn't sexual, but there was a bullying situation, and I easily picked it out just because of my training. I didn't confront the child. It wasn't my job, but I did let the people know. But let's say it had gone something else. You should be able to know who are around your children. You should be able to know who's influencing your kids. This isn't we aren't trying to intimidate in the negative sense, but we are trying to intimidate those that have any harm out for our child. And you nailed it on the head. I think there's too many parents that are looking at sports as a babysitter. They're looking at teachers as saints. I would never want to make a false assumption against anyone, especially at this level. But you can't, like you said, it is unimaginable. And we've got to start stepping in. And as believers who carry the Holy Spirit wherever we go, if you step in a room, you can feel it. If you really let yourself feel it out. I have never gotten the creeps from one of my kids' coaches, but I've gotten a couple of red flags from some parents. And luckily my husband has always been involved in their sports, has always he just waits. He just waits there while they're practicing and lets people know I'm their dad and I'm just going to wait while they're done practicing. That's awesome. Yes. What movies did you watch? What did you do online? I mean, we all know that there's gaming online, there's platforms, there's soft porn, there's hard, like, my son has always been very open. It was never sexual, but there was a couple things some kids engaged in, and they were on an online gaming platform, and they were, again, it wasn't sexual, but he was like, you can't do that. Like, you can't, they were engaging with older kids, and they were just doing, some people will just roll their eyes and say, that's kids. But like, it was a breach of confidence that my son had with his friend. And he's like, no, I'm done. And he's never gone there since.
It could be the start of,
but
the grooming process often lasts for a very long time. So that could have been the start of something, right? May I just speak to that really quickly? Like, often,
oh my gosh.
Again, an offender is going to test the child. So you said your words were, it wasn't sexual. Okay, yes, it wasn't sexual, but if it was something that they're not allowed to do, the offender will typically have the child engage in something they're not allowed to do and then wait. Because what they're doing is they're establishing the loyalty between them. Did they go and tell their parents, right? So they're testing the child. They're testing whether or not that child's going to rush and tell their parents what they're doing.
Yeah. My gosh, that is so. See, I just was like, wait, this is making me look at several things different. And my kids don't game online, but so many parents I know do. They let their kids just play with strangers online. It's like a baby's, this is going to sound rude and I don't know how else to put it, but we've got to stop depending on strangers and technology to babysit our children.
Absolutely.
It's time to be a parent, and we don't live. This is not 1982, even though there were predators then. I get it. This is
way worse. It's way worse. Era. I mean,
it's way more pervasive.
Like, there's the LGBTQ plus people. Yeah. A lot of people are wanting that plus to be pedophilia. That's ridiculous. That should be an accepted sexual.
And people think we're making that up.
No.
And I'm like, you guys, in the field you work in and when I interview people, because I do work in this field, I do work in a different position. I'm listening to people like you. But I have known people who all over the gamut professionally who work in this arena say that is not fake. They're trying to normalize pedophilia.
Absolutely.
That is the direction they're taking. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And these kids, so that these predators can basically have a green light. I've heard that from so many people of different faiths, different belief systems, different professions. They have all told me that. And it's the unimaginable. You can't even wrap your head around it.
Just to give you an example, and then I'll let you go. But when I worked in the child sexual exploitation unit, there was maybe 6 of us, and we handled all of these internet-based files that came in. They were considered international files or whatever. We handled all those types of files. And I mean, yes, we did have a lot of files, but now what I'm hearing is that I think they said there's 30 people in that unit now in the city that I live in, and every police officer has on average 7 files. So like I said, when I was in this unit, there was 6 or 7 of us in the unit, and we handled all those files. Now there's 30 people in that unit. They're overwhelmed. They're not doing anything proactive, whereas we barely used to, because it's like shooting ducks in a pond if you go online. Like, it is crazy how connected, how prolific. It's as bad as drug use. It's as prevalent as drug use, I tell you. Because like I said, every police officer has 7 files at least, and that's not proactive at all. That is simply reactive, responding to people's complaints. Just to give you one example, sorry, to take it back to why we started that unit in the beginning. So we had, let's say, 90 names of different offenders across British Columbia. Now, when we do a search warrant, we go out and we seize their computer. Every one of those offenders would have had an address book, which would have contained several other offenders, which we could not get to because we were responding to other complaints. That work would have been proactive. We never did that. We did not have the capacity to do that.
And a lot of these offenders aren't even the ones that are necessarily making the child pornography that they're selling. Like, I know that
they're connoisseurs. Yeah.
These guys are you're talking about people who are more relational and territorial, and like, versus the bigger fish. I hate to say that are running a business of like child pornography. I mean, I'm not saying they're not involved in child pornography, but there's like tiers of this, because a lot of kids, like you said, these are probably mostly people who have had personal contact with these children versus online only contact. Is that right?
You know what? I'm honestly, I would say it's, you know what, to be honest, I don't know the details of those files. I just know that, that like the luring files, what you would call human trafficking, right? Like, I mean, I was just working with a police officer today who was, telling me she's got a 16-year-old that doesn't want to cooperate, and she knows she's being lured. She's sending a list of pictures of herself. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're being sexploited. Like, I have a whole training, which most of users know, it's free. It's for parents, about online grooming. What is sexploitation? What is all these things how do they get to your kid? I think what we're seeing is, it's not that law enforcement doesn't care. It's that law enforcement is overwhelmed.
Oh yeah,
and
for
parents
sure. Yeah.
got to start taking this seriously and not assuming it won't happen to their child because their child is right over there on the couch with the tablet or in their room with their cell phone. I tell them all the time, I'm like, if you think your child is safe sitting on their bed with their cell phone because they're physically in your house, you're fools. You're fools. And you've got to wake up and realize that these predators, it is their full-time job and obsession.
Yes, absolutely. They put everything they have into gaining access. And just to take that one step further, Charity, I've worked with clients who are actually sexually abused right in their parents' presence. So, for example, family friend is over watching movies with everybody and cuddling under a blanket with, different kid every night, sexually abusing every one of them underneath that blanket right in front of their parents. Like molesting, fondling them. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry, but that adds to the thrill. That adds to the thrill for the offender to be doing it right in front of the parent.
I know. And this is gross. Because it was someone my age. But when I was a teenager, a boy would try that with me when his parents were in the room or my mom was in the room. Yeah. And it was for a thrill. We broke up, but if I'm sick and wrong, I don't want to presume that guy didn't become a normal person. But like, if that is what titillates them, then they'll seek that out. And I mean, that is the level.
Yeah.
And that's why parents, but here's the deal. A healthy adult is going to understand your boundaries for your child.
Yep.
If I were to tell my best friend who loves my son, who would put her life down for my son, hey, new rules. We don't X, Y, and Z. She's not going to say, screw you, I'm out of here. She's going to say, not a problem. I'll do whatever you need. Absolutely. I'll keep him safe. If that's going to keep him safe, I'm all in on the new rules.
For sure.
But we've got to recognize if we lose some friends because they don't like our rules around keeping our children safe, they are free to leave. Because your child is more important than your friendship or offending Aunt Suzanne or Uncle Tommy. And I get that some people will say, well, my grandma and grandpa, they're from a different era, but they do understand the love of a child. And if you say, grandma, grandpa, this isn't about you, this is about our house and we're changing some rules. And if Timmy doesn't want to hug you when you leave, he loves you, but we're going to let him tell us what he wants to do with his body. And if that offends grandma, grandpa, that's sad. I don't want to offend grandma, grandpa. And maybe they're just genuinely offended because they don't understand. But most grandparents, my dad's your grandpa, he's going to say, I totally get it. Whatever makes them comfortable. I'm not going to make them hug me and kiss me goodbye just because they see me twice a year in Florida. You know what I mean? Because my dad cares more about my sons than being offended. So you know what? If so be it. There's the door. I love you, but see you later. Because even if they were ever to hurt your child, they should understand they love this kid more than their own whatever. You know, this has been wonderful, and I'm excited. I'm excited to get the books that you said are coming out. And if you are someone who's listening that has experienced sexual trauma, we want to say there is healing for you, and there's hope, and there's understanding. And although Dr. Kelli, unless you live near her, she can't see you, please don't hesitate to put a comment below or to reach out and ask, who can I talk to? I actually know people locally, but again, I understand you, even with telemed, you do have to be within a certain district. There are counselors, there are survivors, there are people who want you to know this isn't your identity. And you can be free of the shame if someone has ever tried to shame you. And we just want you to know you're loved. And if you're a teenager or a parent who has any suspicions of something, please feel free to reach out for us or local law enforcement, depending on.
Get support. If you're scared to take action alone, get support. But take action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We all know that friend or that, you know what I mean? I can think of 3 people that if something happened to my boys, they'd be more fired up than me. I mean, I'd be pretty fired up, but they would be like, we're doing this and we're handling that. And because if you feel numb or sick to your stomach, I can't imagine. But like you said, you've got to call someone to take action. If you're afraid to take action against someone, call someone who isn't, because action needs to be taken, because it's highly likely there's other victims of this person.
I don't feel like fear is a good excuse to leave a child at risk.
Man, that is the truth. They are. I mean, the world is out for your kids. That's why we do this show. But you're correct. We're empowering. We aren't instilling fear. We're instilling power back to where it belongs, which is those that are protecting kids. But thank you so much, Dr. Kelli.
My
this
pleasure.
was amazing.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We will talk again soon. And please, guys, we'll post below as things come in. So just look below.